Now, I'd like to play one last video, Your Honor, on this subject.
Where do you see?
Sorry, we're not there yet.
Where do you see the source being protectmarriage.com?
3 lines from the bottom on the back page, Your Honor.
Oh, sorry, I was looking at the wrong exhibit. This is exhibit...
DIX 1609, Your Honor.
I see. Okay. All right. You may proceed.
All right. Now, turning your attention to the next tab in your binder, which is tab 76, this is a story from the San Jose Mercury News that's dated October 28th, 2008. And it states, the homeowners, Tom and Kelly Byrne and Frank and Evelina Ibarra, had Yes on 8 Protect Marriage signs posted on their front lawns on Southgate Court for about a week. The Byrnes and Ibarras, friends who live across from each other on the small cul-de-sac, had their garage doors spray painted in large letters with the words, No on 8. The No on 8 slogan refers to the hotly contested Proposition 8 ballot measure in next week's election that would ban same-sex marriage in California. The rear window of the Byrnes minivan was also hit with red spray paint. Does this sort of vandalism have the potential to diminish support for the political goals of the LGBT community?
It does, Mr. Thompson. With the qualifying statement that 3 paragraphs from the bottom in the story, it reads, the No on 8 Proposition campaign issued a statement saying it, quote, condemns vandalism and activities of this kind that are in no way connected to the No on Prop 8 campaign. So, it is clearly activities that the No on 8 campaign disavowed, and that disavowal would certainly have an ameliorative effect on the story.
And the reason they disavowed it, in part, aside from basic decency and fairness, would be politically it's kryptonite, correct?
It's politically not advantageous. But as to the motives of why the campaign disavowed it, I have no reason other than to believe their statement.
Yeah. Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 1792.
Very well. 1792 will be admitted.
Turning to the next tab in your binders, which is tab 77.
When you get to the end of this line, let's take a break.
Okay, and in fact, at this point, we would like to publish another video. This would be DIX 1673.
Your Honor, if counsel could just lay a foundation or explain what we're about to see, that would be helpful.
This is a video entitled Vandals Target Downtown Fresno Church.
Downtown Fresno Church?
Yes, Your Honor.
And I make the same objections, relevance, cumulativeness, and hearsay.
Let's see it. Let's see what it is.
Now, are you aware of the fact that the mayor of Fresno received death threats?
I have no knowledge of that.
Were you aware that pastors received death threats in connection with their support for Prop 8?
Once again, I have no knowledge, no direct knowledge of that.
If that were true, would that tend to diminish the ability of the LGBT community to appeal to norms of fairness?
That it would diminish the ability, I would say yes. But because I don't know the origin of the death threats, or even if perhaps the threats were staged as part of the Yes on 8 campaign, or people were sympathetic to that, I cannot attribute the motive of the individuals involved. From a public relations standpoint, certainly that is not helpful.
And, Your Honor, we have come to a convenient stopping point.
Very well. Before we take our break, and counsel in this matter can just step aside for one moment, I have another matter to attend to, a somewhat happy one. Counsel, why don't we take until 10 minutes after the hour, and then we will resume. How much longer do you have with this witness, Mr. Thompson?
I apologize. It's going a little slower than I anticipated.
Yes, it is.
But I don't know, maybe perhaps another hour.
Maybe you can streamline things?
I will do my best, Your Honor.
All right, fine. Very well, Mr. Thompson, carry on.
Thank you. I'm ripping out pages of my script, Your Honor.
Then maybe I shouldn't interrupt you.
Indeed. All right, Professor. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about the aftermath of Prop 8 and some of the conduct of supporters of the LGBT community and what, if anything, the relationship is to the political power of gays and lesbians in California today. And in particular, I would like to direct your attention to tab 79. This is an article in the New York Times. It's dated February 8th, 2009, and it starts, For backers of Proposition 8, the state ballot measure to stop single-sex couples from marrying in California, victory has been scoured by the ugly specter of intimidation. Some donors to groups supporting the measure have received death threats and envelopes containing a powdery white substance, and their businesses have been boycotted. Professor, when the general public reads in the New York Times about the ugly specter of intimidation and death threats and envelopes containing a white powdery substance, does that dissipate the ability for the LGBT community to appeal to the norm of fairness?
Within the limits, that might be the case. So if your suggestion, Mr. Thompson, is that the already weak political position of gays and lesbians has gotten weaker, I may be inclined to agree. That said, I think we have to take into consideration the role of things like boycotts. So I would not equate boycotts with death threats and intimidation. There are a host of extra electoral or non-electoral forms of political participation which have regularly been turned to by people who are excluded from the political system, and boycotts is one of them. So, for example, it's difficult to imagine the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s without the Montgomery bus boycott or the boycott of white-owned businesses in certain southern towns. Indeed, we can go all the way back to the late 1760s and the early 1770s when women of Boston arranged a boycott of English tea. So, I would not group boycotts of businesses in with violence and intimidation. Of course, I don't know the details of this article, but to the extent that isolated acts of inappropriate behavior have diminished the political power of gays and lesbians, that may well be true.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 2525.
Same objections as to the other exhibits, Your Honor, relevance, hearsay, and cumulativeness.
Very well.
And one more on this one, Your Honor. This is after the election.
The witness has been examined with respect to the contents of this document that's being admitted with that purpose in mind, so I think it's appropriate. But do you have any more questions on this line?
On this line, I do, but feel free, Your Honor.
Well, it's just occurred to me that since Mr. Thompson is exploring the subject, Professor, have you considered what the effect was on the political support for the civil rights enactments of the 1960s, of the riots and the vandalisms and the other acts of illegal and inappropriate behavior that occurred at that time that was associated with, if not the civil rights movement, nevertheless associated frequently with the African Americans in that particular period? Have you considered the effect of those events on the political climate and the subjects that you're opining about?
Not specifically, Your Honor, in part because I was asked to evaluate the relative power or powerlessness of gays and lesbians.
I realize that you haven't considered that in connection with your expert report here, your expert testimony here, but have you considered that in the course of your professional endeavors?
Yes, Your Honor. As a general rule of thumb, any forms of organized violence or even just broad disorderly behavior certainly has a negative impact on the public opinion surrounding the plight of the individuals engaged in it. There is, in addition to it being a somewhat historical effective tactic, nonviolent protest also plays much better as a PR item. However, I think we would be wrong to discount entirely whether or not these acts, which are usually quite spontaneous, may not in fact serve the long-term of interests of the group. So, for example, I'm thinking of the riots in Los Angeles following the verdict of the Rodney King debacle. Those riots set into motion a process called Rebuild LA, where there were substantial investment in really blighted and underserved and underutilized communities in Los Angeles city and county that may have in fact not come about were there not this spontaneous uprising. I'm certainly not defending the actions, Your Honor. I think that that's in the long run less likely to be productive than more likely. But there are moments where those sorts of acts are interpreted by some portions of the perceiving public as a cry for help or an expression of frustration, or maybe a sort of the ultimate expression of powerlessness.
Well, and is there a possibility that the acts that Mr. Thompson has been referring to in his cross-examination might have the same effect in connection with the issues that we're discussing here?
Well, so I'm a little concerned about making that leap for a couple of reasons. So the first is that the most recent act Mr. Thompson talked about took place after the election. So we have to differentiate effects of the election outcome versus effects on the relative power or powerlessness of gays and lesbians. The second thing is we would want to weigh those incidents against the converse. So we have sworn testimony in this courtroom by Mayor Sanders about his house being vandalized by Miss Zia, her being subject to harassment. In fact, the Heritage Foundation report, which was introduced into evidence, makes no attempt to gather evidence of intimidation, vandalism, hostility, violence in the opposite direction. So the Heritage Foundation report, I frankly find a little bit intellectually dishonest. We also know from the hate crimes reports that there were more than 100 acts of violence against gays and lesbians in 2007. I don't know the number for 2008. We know that the nationwide gays and lesbians are more likely to be targeted for violent attack, rape, and murder than any other American on the basis of their identity. Certainly, that would be also weighed in the evaluation of whether or not the public perceives the group sympathetically or hostilely. And we would want to consider both of those things.
Very well. All right, Mr. Thompson, if you wish to follow up, you may certainly do so.
Well, and let's follow up by looking at the next tab, 81, in your binder. This is an LA Times story, and it recounts what appears to be a boycott against a restaurant in Los Angeles, El Coyote. But if we look at the third paragraph into the picture box, it's the one that starts, a boycott was organized on the internet with activists trashing El Coyote on restaurant review sites. Then came throngs of protesters, some of them shouting, "Shame on you," at customers. The police arrived in riot gear one night to quell the angry mob. Now, when the police are called to quell an angry mob, would you agree that that's taking a boycott too far, and that that sort of conduct could have negative effects for the political power of the group you're trying to support?
Certainly. As it is represented in this LA Times story, Mr. Lopez appears to have a flourish for expression. I don't know how angry the mob was, how mob-like their behavior was, or whether or not any arrests were made. As far as there is no, I have no basis to judge what the actual actions were in front of the restaurant. I just know that, you know, a bunch of people showed up, maybe yelled, and police were called, and which might have been a perfectly reasonable thing to do to calm passion. So I can't conclude about whether or not there was activity that went quote unquote too far. I have to tell you, I actually don't have a particular problem with a boycott of a business managed by someone who contributed to an act that disadvantaged a significant share of his or her own customer base. That seems, well, in some of the same language you were using to ask about gays and lesbians, it seems sort of counterproductive to the cause of the business's success. So I actually don't have a problem with the underlying boycott. Clearly, if people behaved inappropriately, if the police made arrests for violence or whatever, that was inappropriate and not helpful to the cause of gay and lesbian political interests.
Well, let's turn to, Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 2528.
Very well, 2528 is admitted.
And now let's skip a few tabs and go to tab 84. This is again a story in the Los Angeles Times, dated February 16th, 2009, and it states, a classroom dispute at Los Angeles City College in the emotional aftermath of Proposition 8 has given rise to a lawsuit testing the balance between First Amendment rights and school codes on offensive speech. Student Jonathan Lopez says his professor called him a fascist bastard and refused to let him finish his speech against same-sex marriage during a public speaking class last November, weeks after California voters approved the ban on such unions. When Lopez tried to find out his mark for the speech, the professor, John Madison, allegedly told him to ask God what your grade is, the suit says. Now, I'm not asking you whether any of this is true or not, but when people read this type of story in the Los Angeles Times, would you agree that it has the tendency and the potential to diminish support for gay and lesbian political power?
Once again, Mr. Thompson, without speaking to the veracity of the recount of the incident, adverse publicity is negative to the interests of the group to whom it pertains.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 2533.
Very well.
Now, you talked a bit about hate crimes yesterday. What makes the bias crime distinct from a traditional assault is that it is the person's membership in a particular group that is the reason for his or her selection as a victim, correct?
That's correct.
And it is that group membership and that group that is the actual target of the crime, correct?
That's correct.
The assailant is trying to create within that community a sense of fear that engaged in a normal discourse of human activity is not available to them at that location, correct?
That's correct.
Your Honor, we would like to, at this point, to publish on the screen DIX 2544. It's a short interview that Bill O'Reilly conducted with someone who went to the Castro after Prop 8 and was assaulted.
Very well.
Your Honor, may I just object? A number of Mr. O'Reilly's questions were leading.
Professor, does that incident, if true, and I'm not asking you to opine on whether it's true or not, but would that fit your definition of a hate crime in that it was a targeted crime that was meant to send a signal that a certain type of person wasn't welcome in a certain location?
It may actually fit my definition of a hate crime. I'm a little bit hesitant because there is the danger of yelling fire in a crowded theater. So, you know, provocative acts are problematic. You can imagine in a racial and ethnic environment, for example, if an African-American approached an Anglo and said, "You racist bastard, you are evil," or whatever, and then the person attacked him, that African-American would not be able to say that was a hate crime because there was provocation involved. And so I guess I'm a little reluctant. The entire incident strikes me as sort of, I'm not even sure how to comment on it, given that it's not a news report. The police didn't witness it. I just don't know what to make of that.
Well, Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 2544.
Very well. And can we move on, Mr. Thompson?
Yes, Your Honor. I just have one more document on this line of questions. And that's what we'll skip to tab 89. And Professor Segura, this is a document from Time magazine entitled, it's November 15th, 2008, What Happens If You're on Gay Rights, Enemies List. And it says in the second paragraph, the Mormon Church is not the only group being singled out for criticism. African Americans, 70% of whom voted yes on Prop 8, according to a CNN exit poll, have become a target. According to eyewitness reports published on the internet, racial epithets have been used against African Americans at protests in California, with some even directed at blacks who are fighting to repeal Proposition 8. Would you agree that when people read this sort of story in Time magazine, it reduces the ability of the gay and lesbian community to appeal to the norm of fairness?
As I have repeatedly testified, Mr. Thompson, anytime there is adverse publicity surrounding a group, it will diminish their abilities to make claims in the public.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 2531.
All right, very well. And you are moving on, are you?
Yes, Your Honor. A new topic, Professor. We've talked a lot about California now, and I want to switch gears and talk more about the national political scene and ask you a few questions about that. And let's skip ahead, if you have no objection, over many tabs to 96D. And this is a story from 1993 from the Los Angeles Times. It's DIX 2587. I'd like to turn your attention to the bottom of page 2, where it says at the bottom of the page, in 1992, the big story was that it was the year of the woman, says Dwayne Garrett, chairman of Dianne Feinstein's Senate campaign. But in California politics, I think the emergence of strong, public, widespread gay and lesbian support was a critical difference in close races. I don't believe that any politician seeking statewide support in either party would be foolish enough to ignore the potential support of the gay community. I think the days are gone when you can run even for a nomination for the Republican Party bashing gays and gay lifestyles. And that was an accurate statement in 1993, do you believe?
I believe that it was inaccurate. It was inaccurate in 1993, and it's even more inaccurate today.
Your Honor, we move to the admission of DIX 2587.
And no objection, Your Honor.
Very well.
And then turning to the next tab, which is tab E. This is an article by Howard Feynman. He is a respected journalist for Newsweek. Is that right?
He's a journalist for Newsweek. I assume his level of respect is high.
Okay. And turning to the bottom of page 1, it says, in Springfield and Washington, not to mention New York, Chicago, Atlanta, San Francisco, and especially Los Angeles, homosexuals are a powerful and increasingly savvy bloc. Would you agree that the homosexual political movement is savvy?
I'm sorry, I don't see where you're speaking, Mr. Thompson.
It's the bottom of page 1, behind tab E. Do you see the...
Can you tell me what paragraph?
It starts with gay power is going traditional at lightning speed. And sorry, I was reading the very last sentence, which was a carryover.
I believe that is a journalistic sort of anecdotal take, I think. I mean, I would not have agreed with this take in 1993, and I would not agree with it today.
Well, let me direct your attention down to on page 2, to the second full paragraph, second sentence from the end, where it says, gays and lesbians, in fact, have become a key source of new funds for sympathetic Democratic candidates nationwide. And do you agree with that statement?
I don't. And I don't think that gays and lesbians are donors to Democratic candidates in certain parts of the country. I would be shocked if there was a substantial gay donations, for example, to Democratic candidates in most of the Great Plains, most parts of the Deep South. So I don't know what basis this reporter is making this claim, but I would not be willing to make a similar claim.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 2586.
Your Honor, I object in terms of relevance. We're back in the early 90s.
Very well. 2586 is admitted. Objection overruled.
Well, let's skip on to tab G, and it's called, this is a story in Time magazine called The Gay Mafia That's Redefining Liberal Politics, and it's dated Friday, October 31st, 2008. And it talks about, if you turn to page 2, the third full paragraph reads in part, among gay activists, the cabinet, and it's referring to this group of wealthy donors. Have you heard of the cabinet?
That's a new one on me, sorry.
Is revered as kind of a secret gay super friends, a homosexual justice league that can quietly swoop in wherever anti-gay candidates are, threatening and finance victories for the good guys. Rumors abound in gay political circles about the group's recondite influence. Some of the rumors are even true. For instance, the cabinet met in California last year with 2 sitting governors, Brian Schweitzer of Montana and Kathleen Sebelius of Kansas, both Democrats. Isn't it true that wealthy gay donors are able to get or attract the attention of lawmakers nationwide?
I object on the basis of the phrase, attract the attention of lawmakers. I'm not sure what that means.
Have meetings with high-ranking officials throughout the country.
I think it would be fair to say that when there is money to be given, there are politicians to come accept it.
Well, that's one thing we can agree on. And I would move the admission of DIX 2590.
Very well. 2590 is admitted.
All right, now let's move on. At the national level, you would agree that political opportunity structure is better than it was 5 years ago, correct?
I would say that the opportunity structure is probably marginally better because of the distribution of controls in the chambers of the legislator and the presidency.
All right, now let's turn to tab 99, and my question is HIV funding an important political priority for the gay and lesbian community?
It is, yes.
All right. And then turning to page 12 and 13 of this document, which is DIX 1337. It's a Congregational Research Service report for Congress. And you can see on page 12, it shows the level of funding, which started in 1982 at $8 million, is well over $20 billion today. And isn't it true that this reflects a measure of success that the gay and lesbian community has had in having funds allocated to HIV?
Mr. Thompson, you are going to have to forgive me, but I am deeply troubled by the notion that this constitutes a success. It could just as clearly be evidence of the number of individuals infected with a life-threatening disease. Because the number has continued to climb both in the United States and worldwide, the level of funds that the U.S. government has dedicated to fighting and treating the disease or preventing it, it has gone up. Perhaps gay and lesbian political interest advocated for this. I would assume that they did. But in the absence of knowing what the monies are spent on, and in the absence of knowing what other interests might have played a role in securing them, some of the money of this money could be going to foreign aid, to Southeast Asia, and Sub-Sahara and Africa, where HIV infections are high. I mean, I don't know what the money is being spent on, so I can't draw political conclusions on the basis of that table.
All right. Your Honor, we would request the admission of DIX 1337.
No objection, Your Honor.
1337 is admitted.
Let's talk about adoption. Adoption is a right that a majority or even a supermajority of gays and lesbians believe they should be afforded, correct?
I think that's correct.
And in the vast majority of states, gays and lesbians have won that political battle and are able to adopt children, correct?
I think that actually misrepresents the political reality. So a substantial number of states, their state laws regarding adoption are silent on the question of whether or not unmarried persons could adopt or whether gay persons could adopt. Some states, for example, prohibit second-party adoption, meaning that if there is a male in place as a father of a child, that a second male could not petition for adoption without abrogating the parental rights of the first male. Because the state only recognizes only one male parent per child, one female per child. But many of those laws predate even the emergence of the gay and lesbian political movement and had to do with split families and stepchildren, and whether or not there could be more than one father legally responsible for a child. So the history of adoption regime in the United States is a history of largely silence on the matter. On the specific matter of whether gays and lesbians or unmarried persons could adopt, some number of states in recent years have taken affirmative steps to prevent gays and lesbians from adopting or from serving as foster parents or some vague legislative combination of that general issue. Those states would include Florida, Mississippi, Oklahoma. I believe Missouri has considered it, Utah. And most recently, in 2008, the state of Arkansas adopted a statewide ballot initiative banning adoption by unmarried persons, which had the effect of banning adoption by gays and lesbians.
But in more than 40 states today, gays and lesbians can adopt children, correct?
That's correct. I made a prediction some years ago that as the anti-same-sex marriage initiative process peaked, as the number of states that, with that initiative process available, left to contest the same-sex marriage issue diminished to zero, that the new front line would be gay and lesbian adoption. Arkansas inconveniently affirmed my prediction. I don't know if those things are pending in other states, but I would not be surprised to see anti-adoption initiatives appearing in the near future.
All right, now let's turn to tab 100. This is, you testified about hate crimes, correct?
I did testify about hate crimes.
Okay, and this is the 2008 hate crime statistics from the FBI's website, and we can see that there were 1,297 incidents of hate crimes against on the basis of sexual orientation, correct?
That's correct. So the FBI They count hate crimes multiple ways. They count the number of actual events. They count the number of offensives that took place, which could be more or less. It's more than. I mean, it could be more than the number of events because multiple offenses could take place. They count the number of victims involved because sometimes hate crimes are perpetrated on more than one person, and they count the number of offenders. So some hate crimes are performed individually and some are performed by groups. So those numbers aren't always exactly the same, but obviously they correlate very, very closely.
Okay, so if we're looking at the first column, we're looking at incidents. Now, if we go in that sexual orientation, number includes hate crimes against transgender individuals, correct?
I don't know, actually. I mean, I don't see that in this table. If you represent to me that in other documents, it does. I have no reason to dispute that.
Just to be clear, I'm not representing. It was a question. I didn't know if you knew.
In this particular table, it doesn't specifically suggest that.
Now, this category includes bisexuals, correct?
It does. They represent a very small percentage of the total, but yes.
Okay. And now, if we go up a few columns, we can see that the anti-Jewish hate crime incidence is 1,013, correct?
That's correct.
And if you go to the next tab in your binder, this is an abstract, and it shows from the U.S. Census Bureau that the Jewish community is 2.2% of the population in the United States. That's in the fourth column. Do you have any reason to dispute that?
I do.
You think that, what is the percentage of the U.S. population that is Jewish?
The percentage of the U.S. population that is Jewish, as I understand it, is between 4 and 4.5%. The difficulty you're having is that this table that you presented under this next tab is actually a percentage of adherents, congressional members. So it has to do with religious observance, not the number of people who could be ethnically or socially identified as Jewish.
All right. Well, let's take your definition of 4 to 4.5%. You would agree that there's a higher incidence of hate crimes against the Jewish community in the United States than against lesbians and gays, since lesbians and gays are 4 to 7% of the population. According to you, and the Jewish community is 4 to 4.5% of the population, correct?
Depending on whether whose population estimates you would use, that would be plausible.
And notwithstanding the regrettable incidents of hate crimes against the Jewish community is politically powerful. It has a meaningful degree of political power, correct?
In my view, it has a fair amount of political power in the U.S. system.
Okay. Now, let's turn to your comparison of African Americans as opposed to, prior to the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, the political power they had as opposed to gays and lesbians. Do you have an opinion on whether gays and lesbians in 2009 in California are better off than African Americans were before the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
The term "better off" is the rub in your question, Mr. Thompson. So my argument would be that from an economic perspective and from a social perspective, it is quite likely that in the case that gays and lesbians in California in 2010 are better off than many, perhaps even most African Americans prior to the passage of civil rights legislation.
All right, and turning to tab, it's where it's tab 2. We're starting with new numbers. African American members of the United States Congress, and we have listed here the numbers in the U.S. House of Representatives. From 1939 to 1945, there was 1, and from 1945 to 1955, there were 2. Do you have any reason to doubt those numbers?
I have no reason to doubt those numbers.
And the African American community was about 10% of the population in the 1950s. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. Now, let's then look at the comparison. And turning to the next tab, we can see that women until Congress, if we focus on the first half of the 1970s, they had between 10 and 16 members of the House of Representatives. Do you have any reason to doubt those numbers?
I don't.
And in the Senate, there was 1 senator for a couple of years, 2 female senators from 71 to 73, and 0 senators, female senators, from 1973 to 1975. Do you have any reason to doubt those numbers?
I do not.
And women in the 1970s were less politically cohesive than gays and lesbians are today, correct?
I would have to actually go back and do analysis on that. I think that's probably the case. I think the partisan division among women would be much more even than it is among gays and lesbians if we went back to that period of time. But again, without data in front of me, I'm reluctant to draw conclusions.
Now, you talked about politicians who make disparaging comments against gays and lesbians. I believe you referred to Senator Tom Coburn. Do you recall that?
I do recall Senator Coburn.
When was the last time a statewide official from California made a disparaging remark about gays or lesbians?
Because I do not have encyclopedic knowledge of all comments made by all statewide elected officials, I couldn't possibly say.
Can you identify one?
Once again, I couldn't possibly say. I don't know.
Just so the record is clear, you can't identify a single anti-gay remark made by a statewide California official in the last quarter century, correct?
In the last quarter century?
Right.
Well, give me a minute. Again, I would want to be able to go and look at some of the statements that were made by various members of the political system during the statewide ballot contest on quarantining those infected with HIV and comments made in the mid-'80s. I mean, I would be shocked if they were zero, but again, I just don't have encyclopedic knowledge of everything anyone has ever said for, 25 years.
You would agree that it is unlikely that an openly anti-gay politician would win the governorship of California, correct?
I'm not sure I agree with that at all.
Well, wait a minute. Now, let's look at your back to binder 1, your deposition, page 240 of your deposition, and line 3. Do you recall when I asked you on, here is the colloquy question, do you think that in the next gubernatorial election in California that an openly anti-gay politician could win the governorship of California? Mr. Goldman. Objection, incomplete, hypothetical, calls for speculation. Answer, no, largely because of the political distributions in the state. So this state has an electorate that is pretty significantly Democratic. And you gave that testimony, correct?
Yeah, I did.
Your Honor, I object. The question that counsel asked today was whether an open anti-gay politician could ever be elected. The question that was asked in deposition talked about the next election. So I think
Sustained.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Well, in the next election, would you agree that an openly anti-gay politician could not win the governorship of California?
In the next election, I would consider that to be unlikely.
All right. Now, let's look to trends, looking to the general public. Young people tend to be more supportive of gay and lesbians' rights than old people, all other things being equal, correct?
All other things being equal, I would say that that's correct. But I would say that at a national level, there's pretty good evidence for substantial regional variation in that, but in terms of degree. But as a general principle, younger people tend to be more accepting of gays and lesbians than older people.
All right, now, let's turn to the next tab 5. This is January 18th, 2010. Article in the New Yorker entitled, "A Risky Proposal. Is it too soon to petition the Supreme Court on gay marriage?" And turning to page 3 of this document.
Why do we need this, Mr. Thompson?
Your Honor, I'll be done in 5 minutes, Your Honor.
This is a rather personally directed to your opposing counsel, and I think it's certainly at the edge of the pale.
Your Honor, if I may, I just want to ask him about polling data in it. That's the only question I had, but I'm gonna seek this and try to move this in. But if the court would prefer that I move on, I'm happy to do so. Let me ask it this way. Leaving aside this document, would you agree that the polling data you have seen, that 58% of Americans between the age of 18 and 29 support gay marriage, but that older Americans over 65, only 22% agree?
That reports Pew Charitable Trust data. I have no reason to dispute it. I haven't looked at the data set directly.
But leaving aside that particular data set, would you agree that as a general matter, younger Americans are much more supportive of gay marriage on average than older Americans?
I would agree that if we took a snapshot in time and did a cross-sectional examination that younger members of the citizenry would be more supportive of same-sex marriage. I'm reluctant to then conclude that at the maturation process, as the maturation process takes place, and cohorts leave the electorate, and new cohorts come into as electorate, that there's an automatic suspicion that we are on our way to majority support. It may well be likely, actually, but these data don't necessarily demonstrate that.
All right, one last set of questions on one last document, and it's behind tab 9. And this is an article that you wrote entitled From Radical to Conservative, Civil Union, Same-Sex Marriage, and the Structure of Public Attitudes. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. Now let's turn to page 13, and it says in the first full paragraph, where does the public stand today on same-sex marriage and civil unions? And let me pause to ask you, Professor, when did you write this?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't recall. It was several years ago. It was presented at a 2005 meeting, so in all likelihood in the summer of 2005, give or take.
Okay. Okay. Table 2, the results from 3 polls taken just after Massachusetts began issuing marriage licenses in the summer of 2004. As is immediately apparent, support for both same-sex marriage and civil unions has climbed. To compare these results with those reported in Table 1, we make the simplifying assumption that supporters of marriage rights would support rather than oppose unions in a binary choice. Comparing these results to yearly ones, the shift in opinion is frankly astounding. When you wrote that, was that accurate, yes or no?
Well, excuse me just a second. I would like to finish reading the paragraph. I did write that, and if you would continue reading, it would be clear that
I'm going to read the rest of the paragraph, sir.
Okie dokie.
Just want to focus on that part, although the portion I read thus far, was that accurate at the time you wrote it?
Yes.
Now, I'll continue. Through support for unions topped at 49% in Gallup's May 2003 poll by the summer of 2004, after the event in Massachusetts, San Francisco, Canada, and elsewhere, support for at least civil unions climbed to between 61 and 68% in the 3 polls reported in Table 2. Moreover, outright opposition to all legal recognition dropped from 49% in 2003 and 67% in 1996 to a scant 27% by November 2004, a month in which the president was reelected in part on an anti-gay marriage platform. This represents a shift of 20% points in 4 years and as many as 40 points in an 8-year time span. While question, wording, sample frame, and other factors make the results not strictly comparable, the evidence of rapid, massive opinion change is substantial. And when you wrote that, that was accurate, correct?
With respect to the subject matter that I was describing, it was accurate.
We have no further questions, Your Honor.
Very well. Mr. Boutros, you may redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor, let me see here. Why don't we start with the article that Mr. Thompson was just referring to? And perhaps you can explain your views relating to the, what was that article about?
Thank you, Mr. Boutros. The article was an attempt to understand change in opinion on civil unions. So the subject matter of the article was about civil unions. And specifically, I looked into the public opinion literature to examine the impact of what happens when an issue of public concern has 3 rather than 2 policy choices available to it. Because when we normally think of contestation over public policy issues, it's usually a pro or con position. But the gay union issue is made more complex by the presence of 3 alternatives. And so what the article was about was that once Massachusetts adopted or had a court-ordered adoption of gay and lesbian same-sex marriage rights, that support for civil unions climbed. And in the paper, I speculated in part It claimed as a strategic behavior that people opposed to same-sex marriage might support civil unions in a sense to undermine the compelling nature of the case for marriage equality. So I think, if you read the entire piece, what's astounding is the shift in support for civil unions. That notwithstanding, I'm perfectly happy to say that there have been a substantial increase in the public's level of support for all forms of government recognition of gay and lesbian couples. But that, when the word astounding was put in there, it was a reference to the growth and support for civil unions.
Do the views that you expressed in that article concerning excuse me, civil unions affect your view today regarding the political powerlessness of gay men and lesbians in the United States?
They were certainly something I would consider. So if it were the case that the level of hostility to gays and lesbians or the level of opposition to any form of the union was much, much higher, that would have a negative effect on my assessment of power. The fact that it's trending in a positive direction certainly speaks well for what the future might be for gays and lesbians in American society. But as I indicated, I believe during the first day of my testimony, when opinions change, there are sometimes ceiling and floor effects. And there's no reason necessarily to assume it's always monotonic. It doesn't have to move in one direction.
Well, when you talk about civil unions, that's roughly the equivalent of domestic partnerships in California.
It's roughly the equivalent of enhanced domestic partnerships that was adopted in California, not the original version.
Now, one of the documents that Mr. Thompson showed you was a press release touting the fact that Gray Davis had signed into law domestic partnership legislation.
I recall.
And what ultimately happened to Gray Davis in terms of his political career in California?
Gray Davis was recalled from office.
Okay. I want to turn now to the subject of boycotting. Mr. Thompson asked you some questions about boycotts relating to those who are opposed to same-sex marriage in California. Have boycotts traditionally been a tool used by oppressed minorities in the United States political history?
Sure. That issue at stake is if people are peripheralized by the existing political process. The tools that other groups would use to sort of push their case forward in the political system are substituted for tools that are more available to peripheral groups. As I indicated in Mr. Thompson's cross, there are examples of boycotts going back even into the pre-revolution end period in the United States, where individuals who felt like they didn't have a voice in the political system could achieve their goals through this. When you teach a course of American political theory, for example, David Thoreau's on the duty of civil disobedience, is regularly on the part of the reading list, because this long and deep tradition in American politics, and it continues even until this day. So the African American community used boycotts, as mentioned in my answer, extensively. The Latino community, particularly in this state, the United Farm Workers Union, used a nationwide grape boycott to good ends in order to achieve a grape contract, a union contract with the grape growers in the Central Valley and the Coachella Valley of California. So boycotts have a long and deep tradition in American political life.
Well, Mr. Thompson also raised some questions about the civil rights movement involving African Americans, and Chief Judge Walker asked you a question relating to that. In the civil rights movement, economic boycotts were used as a means for African Americans to seek to achieve equality. Is that correct?
That's correct. And there is some great work documenting the use of boycotts by African Americans. Boycotts are difficult to sustain. In gain theoretic terms, we refer to them as all or nothing goods. That they work only if there is a wide-scale adherence to the boycott. One of the strategies used by white citizens in the South to try to resist boycotts would be to essentially insist that their domestic help go and shop at a store on behalf of their employer during the day, and the store might have been subject to a boycott. And so that would create the illusion that the boycott was failing because African Americans were walking into the store. And one of the ways that the African Americans resisted that was that the domestics would wear maids' uniforms. These are including women who have never worn a uniform in their role as a domestic, would put on a uniform so that when they were walking into the store, other members of their community could see that they were not breaking the boycott, but that they were shopping on behalf of their employer. So these are difficult things to sustain, but they can be used effectively by groups who have less avenues open to them in the normal political process.
During the 1960s, did the civil rights group encourage economic boycotts of white merchants who were discriminating?
They did.
And was that in the South?
That was in the South, yes.
And Martin Luther King preached a philosophy, articulated a philosophy that focused on nonviolent demonstrations in order to get the message across on behalf of African Americans in civil rights, correct?
That's correct.
Were there times during the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King and others where, despite those efforts to have nonviolent economic and other protests, that certain members of the African community and those supporting that community engaged in conduct that went over into more violent activity?
Sure. I'd answer that in sort of two ways. The first is that it's important to remember that Martin Luther King's prominence in the civil rights movement was the result of a boycott, that the Montgomery bus boycott, which was begun with the famous Rosa Parks incident, served as the basis for the creation of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and a local minister named Martin Luther King became the chair of that. So participating in a boycott was the basis of his rise to prominence, and he certainly didn't see boycotts as inconsistent with his view on nonviolent collective action. That notwithstanding, there were certainly moments. When confronted with unspeakable, violence or provocation or harassment, that someone in the black community in the South would lash out, and I don't think we would find that particularly surprising. It did help the cause. It certainly did. It certainly did not. Did it, have a negative impact on public relations? Of course it did. And you try to weigh that against the other visual images that went into people's homes during that period of time.
Well, and the fact that during the civil rights movement, African Americans and their supporters were engaging in economic boycotts, does that suggest to you that they were politically powerful?
Well, I mean, as you know, even in the 1960s, African Americans had at least the constitutional imprimatur of equality, even though it wasn't enforced. But as a general rule of thumb, boycotts, protests, picketing are strategies used by people who are less powerful in the political system, for whom traditional means of political action are less productive.
Are those sort of activities, boycotts, picketing, demonstrating, firmly entrenched in our political and democratic government?
Firmly entrenched and deeply rooted in our history. People recall that. I mean, the first shots fired in the Revolutionary War were at the Boston Massacre, but in fact, the Boston Massacre was English troops opening fire on a protest mob of Americans who were unhappy with their governance by the Crown.
Are you familiar with a decision by the Supreme Court called NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware?
I am.
I would like to display demonstrative number 9, please. In the Claiborne Hardware case, was an instance where the NAACP had promoted boycotting. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding, yes.
Perhaps you could read into the record this quote that I have displayed from the Claiborne hardware case.
The boycott of white merchants at issue in this case took many forms. The boycott was launched at a meeting of a local branch of the NAACP attended by several hundred persons. Its acknowledged purpose was to secure compliance by both civic and business leaders with a lengthy list of demands for equality and racial justice. The boycott was supported by speeches and nonviolent picketing. Participants repeatedly encouraged others to join in its cause.
Now let's go to demonstrative number 10. If you could, which is another quote from the Claiborne hardware. If you could read that into the record, please, sir.
Sure. Speech itself also was used to further the aims of the boycott. Non-participants repeatedly were urged to join the common cause, both through public address and through personal solicitation. These elements of the boycott involve speech in its most direct form. In addition, names of boycott violators were read aloud at meetings at the First Baptist Church and published in a local black newspaper. Petitioners admittedly sought to persuade others to join the boycott through social pressure and the threat of social ostracism. Speech does not lose its protected character, however, simply because it may embarrass others or coerce them into action.
Is it your understanding that the Supreme Court found that those boycotting activities referenced in those quotes you mentioned were protected by First Amendment?
That's my understanding.
Now, this was a lawsuit, and the white merchants who were being boycotted sued the NAACP, correct?
That's correct.
They essentially argued, they asserted that they were the victims because certain members of the boycotting group had, their conduct had crossed over into violence, correct?
That's my understanding.
And the Supreme Court, nonetheless, found that the speech activities and the nonviolent activity was protected by the First Amendment.
That's correct.
Do you see any parallels between the white merchants suing the NAACP and claiming that they were the victims of civil rights activity by the African Americans and their supporters, and what you heard Mr. Thompson asking you about today, the claims that people throwing eggs at the window or tearing down a lawn sign made the Proposition 8 proponents the victims in this matter?
I mean, the parallels are fairly obvious that, you know, acts of violence and vandalism are regrettable and inappropriate, and we begin with that stipulation. It is not clear to me that those acts of violence are necessarily associated with the protected and indeed applauded normal political practice of interest seeking redress through legislative or electoral process. And I don't think that we could fairly condemn or even implicate the leaders of the No on 8 campaign or the associated organizations with these acts, that individuals sometimes behave badly. And individuals whose motions run high frequently behave badly. But I don't think that necessarily is an indictment of the entire position or the entire group.
Are you aware of any literature whatsoever, political science or otherwise, that has suggested that the results of the Proposition 8 campaign, which resulted in the enactment into law of Proposition 8, were caused by the news reports that Mr. Thompson cited to you, or other news reports regarding sporadic allegations of violence or tearing down of lawn signs and the like by Proposition 8 opponents?
I don't know of any journalistic suggestions that determine that outcome, and I don't know of any academic suggestions that it would simply, because that notion at some level is implausible. That some number of individuals might have been motivated by reading or seeing some of these news stories is possible, in fact, even likely. That the number of individuals that would be true would come close to the margin of victory for the proposition would be doubtful in the extreme. Moreover, it also, when you think about it in terms of process, it suggests that someone who was previously disposed not to take away marriage rights from gays and lesbians changed his or her mind and decided to take away marriage rights from gays and lesbians because of an act of vandalism in Carlsbad or Fresno or whatever. So it's just, it defies credulity that one or two individuals, or even 100 or 200 individuals, might have done this. Maybe I just can't imagine that it affected that outcome.
Mr. Thompson also showed you Defendant's Exhibit 458, which was that Heritage Foundation backgrounder.
That's correct.
Do you recall that?
Uh-huh.
Are you familiar with the Heritage Foundation?
I am.
Can you briefly describe your understanding of what the Heritage Foundation is?
I think the Heritage Foundation is fairly identified as an extremely conservative think tank.
And you reviewed that article, or it's called A Backgrounder in the Heritage Foundation, correct?
I did.
Were you familiar with the author of that article?
I wasn't when I first picked it up, but then I went and kind of Googled him. I guess Google is a verb, but I don't know him directly.
Is he someone known to be an expert in political science?
I'm not familiar with his name, so I know many political scientists, and as you know, I'm president of the second largest professional association, but I don't know him.
And you sit on several editorial boards. You testified yesterday, political science journals and the like, correct?
I do.
In that capacity, do you conduct peer review articles submitted for consideration in publication?
I do.
Does that Heritage Foundation backgrounder meet the standards that would qualify it for publication in a peer review journal?
It does. And in fact, most journal editors would not even submit it for review and return it to the author with the suggestion that it does not conform to social scientific standards, and even provide some guidance as to how to go about fixing it.
Could you give me a couple of reasons why it would not conform to those standards?
Well, for starters, in a social scientific journal, we would want to be looking for the evidence-gathering techniques, the degree to which the evidence represented an accurate sample of the acts that took place. There is a flaw in empirical logic called selecting on the dependent variable when, as you are setting out to observe a particular instance and you only study cases where the instance occurred, you can't possibly know the causal structure because you only have the presence of a phenomenon, not the absence. So taking it into a different area to avoid getting people unhappy, imagine if we were doing a study of war and we wanted to know the causes of war. If the political scientists only looked at wars and didn't look at cases where war didn't start, we couldn't possibly know what factors led to war or don't lead to war.